On the morning of April 10th, 2001, I remember waking up in the morning, about 6, my normal time. Didn't really feel very good, didn't feel like I was up to going to school that morning, so I thought I might, sleep in until about third period, which started around 11. So I set my alarm clock for 11 o'clock, and next thing I remember is waking up in the Juvenile Detention Center in Ephrata, Washington. What went through my mind when I first realized where I was, where am I at? What am I doing here? What happened today? What went wrong? They asked me if I knew why I was there, and I had no idea. I asked them what had happened, and they told me that I had taken a gun to my third period class and held them hostage for a number of minutes.
What bothers me about this whole thing is that now we know that Corey was hallucinating on Paxil just a month after he went on them. Corey is afraid to tell us about the hallucinations and the bad dreams because he thought he was going crazy. This is a Mormon boy who had never smoked or drank, never used illegal drugs, didn't know what a hallucination was from Adam.
The first drug was Ritalin, and that was really, really bad. Because they told my mom that I had ADHD. They started focusing on me and, forgot about everybody else, and they just looked at me and focused on me. And it makes you feel like you're really, really tired, you don't want to eat.
Between 1995 and 2000, the number of prescriptions of psychotropic drugs of all kinds for kids more than doubled.
The problem with being a child in America today compared to 20 or 30 years ago is that if you are different, if you are agitated, if you are extremely active, you will fall under the gaze of the helping professions, the so-called helping professions.
I don't remember anyone I went to school with being on a mind-altering medication. But now, the number of children on drugs in this country is astronomical.
Jefferson County 911. Yes, I'm a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun.
Eric Harris was taking the antidepressant Luvox for a full year while he developed all his bizarre and violent fantasies.
And the school is in a panic, and I'm in the library. I've got students down under the tables, kids. Heads under the table.
I believe that Eric Harris was literally driven crazy, as so many other children have been, while taking this antidepressant drug.
I think the pharmaceutical companies realized a while ago that there were huge profits to be made on playing on parents' fears and also playing on a generation of parents that was looking for the convenient way to raise their children.
ADHD is a means of making paying patients out of normal individuals, and once they are given a prescription and put on medications that are virtually never discontinued, they have lifetime paying patients. That's what's behind the epidemic.
Medication is an answer that can be helpful to some people some of the time.
There needs to be a balance between the interaction of biological treatments and psychological treatments.
I didn't have Brian diagnosed with ADHD until he was in the 5th grade. And that led, of course, to prescriptions. And when those prescriptions didn't work, that led to more prescriptions. And the more prescriptions he got, the more frustrated that we all got. He couldn't get better. He couldn't help himself. He got angry, and the angrier he got, the more violent he got.
Each morning in the United States, between 6 and 7 million children are given a prescription medication before they can go to school. Many of them are taking Ritalin or other amphetamines.
More and more aspects of human behavior, human distress, just general unhappiness is becoming medicalized. It's being made into diseases. This culture has grown in parallel with the growth of the pharmaceuticals industry and its investment in psychotropic drugs, that is, drugs that affect the psyche, the mind, the brain.
By far the majority of psychiatric prescriptions for children are given for attention deficit disorder, ADD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD.
One of the alarming concerns I have both as a parent and as a physician is that there is much misdiagnosis and overprescription of medication, inappropriate prescription of medication, changing these children's lives forever for the worse.
Why didn't my generation, the baby boomer generation, have this? Why didn't we have thousands of kids committing suicide when I was going to school or you were going to school? Why didn't we have kids walking to schools like this one behind us and shooting up their classmates for no apparent reason?
My son Michael pretty much had a very bad experience in public school, along with my family. He started kindergarten, and I got a lot of phone calls that he was not sitting in his chair. He was not on task, as the teacher said.
As a classroom teacher, you're given a list of 9 categories. If a child demonstrates 6 of these manifestations in these categories, for example, can't sit in his seat, fidgets, jumping out of his chair, doesn't wait his turn, things that are commonly done with youngsters who are energetic. You find 6 out of those 9, and that child can be labeled as ADD, meaning attention deficit, a shortage of, he can't focus his attention.
One of the problems with the diagnosis for ADHD is that it's very subjective. It's basically a list of behaviors.
There's very clearly at least 100 different problems that can look like ADHD. I do believe it exists and it's a genetic disorder, but it's a diagnosis of exclusion. You rule out everything else first before you even consider it. And that's not what we see being done today.
Parenting style is not a cause of ADD and ADHD. There are several causes. One of them we know of is hereditary. For example, if the parents have attention deficit disorder or ADHD or those kinds of symptoms, their children are more likely to experience those symptoms as well. There are also several prenatal causes for ADHD, as well as low birth weight, if the mother was smoking or drinking during her pregnancy, and things like that can also have an impact on causing ADHD. But it's very important for people to understand that parenting style is not a cause of ADD or ADHD. At the same time, parenting style can, with a child who has attentional problems and hyperactive problems, cause greater difficulties, and at the same time can also improve the situation a great deal.
When my little boy was 6 years old, when he first started kindergarten, on his very first day of school, the school kept calling me up at work 10, 20 times saying, "Vincent won't sit still, or we have a problem with your son." And they called me in for a meeting with the principal, a social worker, psychologist, and the teacher, and they said, "You're either going to have to put your son on Ritalin, or we're going to put him in a school for special needs children."
My name is Riley.
Riley?
I love cars and trucks and trains.
Do you?
I like race cars.
The main symptom under hyperactivity, the one that is considered by the Psychiatric Association manual to have the most power, the symptom is, quote, often fidgets with hands or feet or squirms in seat. That's it. That is the most powerful symptom.
Under impulsivity, the first criteria is often blurts out answers before questions have been completed. And under inattention, the first criteria is often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork or other activities. And if you look at how this diagnosis has been formulated, it's to refine disruptive classroom behavior with the purpose of being able to medicate, under these psychiatric guidelines.
Michael, to hear the experts say that if you manifest any number of symptoms like easily distracted, blurting out an answer before you're asked, daydreaming and looking out the window, fidgeting at your desk, unable to sit still, that these are symptoms of this mental disorder called ADHD. What do you think about that?
That was me. All those things were me. Seriously, if this had been
the way things were run back when I was growing up. You know, always asking questions, always seeming a bit agitated, always, you know, my mind drifting off into some, you know, creative place. I'll tell you, they would have had me so doped up, you guys never even would have heard of me. There never would have been a Roger and me or anything else.
First grade, when the work got a little more difficult and they had a lot longer periods of sitting down behind a desk. At that point, I was going through a divorce, and he had some emotional issues with the divorce and the custody pursuit that was ongoing at that point. And I was called in several times by the school principal because of his behavior, because he was distracted, he wasn't focusing, he wasn't sitting down doing his work, wandering around. And at one point she told me she knew I was going through family counseling with him, but counseling was very slow, and that if I didn't opt for medication, that she would find a way to transfer him out to a special education center.
Some parents are very resistant to giving their children medication. The most effective form of treatment for attention deficit disorder is a combination of psychotropic medication along with cognitive behavioral therapy. Research has consistently supported this.
There's a saying in medicine that if all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. You know, so if a child comes in and they're inattentive, they must have ADHD, which is simply not true. We see kids who are reacting to the divorce of parents. They become oppositional or depressed or irritable because they're reacting to a chaotic home life.
A child is liable to be diagnosed ADHD if he or she steps out of line, speaks out of turn. In short, just about any sort of disorderly conduct would beget on the part of a teacher a suspicion of ADHD, or might even lead to that teacher making such a diagnosis.
Just describing a behavior is not getting necessarily to the underlying cause of what the problem is. I see children that are brought in here by their parents. I'll give you an example. I have an attorney who brought her 5-year-old daughter in here to be seen by me, who was told that she had hyperactivity and attention deficit, and it turned out that this child had allergies to certain foods. And when these allergies in the foods and also the environment were handled, the symptoms went totally away.
It is now widely recognized that the symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are shared by many children exposed to PCBs, the polychlorinated biphenyls, and lead. In 1996, Herbert L. Needleman published a report in the Journal of the American Medical Association revealing a strong link between lead in children's bones and delinquent behavior. Several studies since 1996 have confirmed what Needleman found. Many studies showed that children exposed to lead not only had learning problems, but also were distractible, disorganized, impulsive, and restless, the hallmarks of attention deficit disorder. In short, the mechanisms that regulates attention and self-control is damaged by lead.
How many students have you seen would come to school bouncing off the walls in the morning, and you change their diet or make suggestions to parents, get them off sugar, get them off dairy, and then they come back and they're okay? Does that happen?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Get them off TV. Yeah.
Get them off TV?
Yeah.
I used to think, 10, 15 years ago, when we were raising our daughter, people would pop The Little Mermaid in the VCR. The kid would watch it 29 times, and that became, the pacifier.
And no wonder they can't pay attention to something for 20 minutes, because when they're watching television, their brains are becoming lazy from the visual input that they're getting from television.
Can tell what child watches television before he comes to school in the morning. Can tell you as they walk in the door.
Mm-hmm. How? Why?
Because they're out of control. They're not being themselves. They're being some character. They're acting in a way that's obviously not them.
What we have to remember is that children's behavior is a product of what they see in their homes. In this fast-paced society, their parents are often on the cell phones, pacing back and forth. Well, the child's not blind. The child's going to see that. And the child is going to imitate what the parent is doing.
I now long for the days when I saw people popping The Little Mermaid in 29 times as the pacifier. because that's not the pacifier now. The pacifier now is pop a pill in their mouth.
Isn't it amazing that suddenly there's a new disease that jumped over all these, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, our generation, and suddenly our kids, or the first generation, get this new disease.
Right, and of course they call it genetic.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
It's likely that a 10-year-old boy in 1960 would not be supervised by as many adults as he is supervised today. From the moment he wakes up today, he is looked at and observed and driven and taken different places, whereas probably in 1960 he would get a chance to run around with his friends for 2-3 hours. There was an increased sense of perhaps safety that the parents felt, and this child would be interacting with other people, would not be spending most of his time either in darkened rooms in movies or watching television or playing by himself with electronic toys. So there would be much more social interaction in that child's life than you would see today.
ADD is not new. ADD was actually described over 100 years ago by a pediatrician who described a group of kids who had short attention spans, were impulsive and hyperactive. Ritalin was actually released in the United States in the early 1950s, so we've known ADD has been around for a long time. However, there are clear societal factors that are increasing the expression of ADD. As we require kids to stay in school longer to get the best jobs, ADD kids drop out first. And if they drop out of school first, they have babies first. So actually ADD families have more families per 100 years, so they'll have 5 generations per 100 years, where a non-ADD family will only have 4.
My grandfather was born 3 years after the Civil War. That's my grandfather. You know, I'm still a fairly young guy, so do the math there. That's, you know, only 2 generations back takes me back to the Civil War, and a grandfather who was alive when I was alive. Everyone got married late, it seemed, through the generations in my family, and had their kids late. The benefit of that, though, is that I got to hear real stories of what it was like in the 1860s and how they lived, and what the evening was like, what the evening meal was like, how everyone, of course, not only ate together, you grew the food together. You prepared the food together, you ate together, and then after dinner, you would go into what we call the living room now, and you would read together, you would play music together, and, you know, that's the way my grandfather was raised, that's the way my mother was raised, and that's the way I was raised. There were musical instruments in the house, the television was not a babysitter. Discussions were had, and that is not what's going on now.
I mean, when I was raised by 2 perfectly normal, probably extraordinarily loving parents who happened to have been President and First Lady, there weren't drugs for kids. There wasn't a need. There wasn't a I don't remember the label ADD ever being used when I was in high school or grade school. So no, it's not something that my parents had to deal with.
Kids playing, splashing in the water, chasing each other, yelling, having a lot of fun. Where I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, that was normal. From the age of 1 to 6, you didn't have a whole lot of supervision. You went out in the daytime, you played, you built forts, you ran to each other's homes, got home by dinner time or lunch. Not true today. Today, we don't have children as much as we have little adults. In fact, we almost are obsessed about micromanaging the lives of our children.
You didn't have this high expectation among parents, particularly middle class and upper middle class parents, that kids had to achieve and start achieving really by infancy, when they start working out on their infant gyms, and then when they start their first classes as they're moving into 1.5 years or 2 years. Parents want to build a resume for their kids starting at these very, very young ages.
They are being pushed academically, they're pushed to achieve, and so what's happening is that the scale is becoming imbalanced. While the weight is on them to achieve, they're losing that ability to get out there and experience life in their own way.
They all used to look at me, the teacher, Mrs. Brady, the principal, and not focus on anybody else except me.
It was just very disturbing. As a parent, I felt like I didn't want my son in a different school, and I felt very pressured.
Mrs. Brady used to tell me that, she had eyes behind her head. Eyes behind her head, and she could see through walls.
The children who are the most energetic, the ones who have that creativity and energy, many of those children are getting into a lot of, quote, trouble because they're not falling into the groove. They're not falling into the pattern. They want to know. They can't wait their turn. They're raising their hand. That's not fair to them. I mean, what should be happening is that energy that they have, which is so beautiful, should be channeled. And it should be channeled into a direction where they can create with that and use that in a positive way instead of it being used against them, that they're not following the, quote, norm.
This one can chew, and this one can do fireballs, and this one can do this. This one doesn't go down, but this one does, and goes like... I'm asking you for just loudness. That's what it does. They're double shooters.
Approximately 10% of boys from ages 6 through 12 or so are taking psychotropic medication. And this is just an appalling statistic to me as a parent and as a physician.
In the early 90s, there was a huge spike in children being diagnosed ADHD and subsequently being put on Ritalin. At that time, several things happened. The federal government awarded schools more money based upon more children being diagnosed ADHD. And also for low-income families, if a child was diagnosed ADHD and put on Ritalin, the family received a lot more money monthly.
It's frightening how easy it is for children to be diagnosed. They are being diagnosed by school teachers and by school personnel of all types in all school districts across the country.
I don't think teachers are the best diagnosticians. They certainly are good observers. They can see what happens in a classroom. They can make good comments about what they see in a child, and that can be put into the diagnostic hopper. But I certainly do not agree that they're the ones who make a decision about whether a child should receive or not receive medication. If the child has a problem and needs medication, sure, he should be getting it. But let's leave the school out of it if we can.
You see this phenomena around the world where children are nearly considered a disease.
You don't quite see it around the whole world. It is mostly occurring in North America, in Australia, Great Britain, but beginning to occur on a mass scale around the world because of the efforts of America, which is exporting its way of looking at children.
There are many children in my practices, as well as other neurologists' practice, who are treating children with very severe neurological problems, like in the ADHD spectrum, where medications are extremely valuable, and the child would not be able to function without the use of a medication. That's not where I have a problem with medicating children. The problem I have with medicating children is the error that we make of commission, where we're treating children who are just, struggling, but don't have ADHD, but are labeled ADHD because it gets them through the door to get that prescription for the Ritalin or another medication.
So I took him out of that school and I put him in another school. Everything was fine for a while until they got the records from the other school. Then the same thing happened. They started calling me at work saying, Vincent won't sit still, you need to come in and have a meeting. And again, I went to the meeting and they said, you have to put your son on Ritalin or we'll put him in a special school. I took him out of that school and put him in another school, Sunnyvale. And that is where they called CPS, Child Protective Services, and when I was at work, they took my son out of daycare and they put him in an institution. When I got home from work, there was a card on my door from a police officer, and it said, please call me regarding your son.
The Division of Family Services was originally set up to protect children, but I don't see that happening anymore. They're used as a way for people to report one another, for children to even report their parents. Instead of helping children, I see them going into homes, pulling these kids out of homes so that they can put them on drugs.
I called the Sunnyvale Police Department, and then immediately I picked up the phone to call my mother. And the next thing I know, the police officer just came right through my door without even knocking or anything. He grabbed the phone away from me. He says, "You're not calling anyone." And he slammed me down. I thought, this guy's crazy. And so I started crawling away from him, and he grabbed my ankles so hard and pulled me back that I still have his fingerprints in my ankles to this day.
If a school pressures a parent to put their child on the drug, and the parent thinking they have to do this in order for their child to attend school, and the child has a bad reaction to that drug, that the school should be held responsible. That's my personal opinion. So you're getting into a dangerous area, a school, which should stick to academics when they go into that area.
When I ask teachers to give me a report, what I ask is for a description of the child's behavior plus the completion of a questionnaire which indicates or suggests that what their level of activity is. It's helpful, but it's not conclusive. In other words, it tells me how a child may be functioning in school and whether or not there are problems. Very often, it is the teacher who may refer a child for evaluation because of their failure to do well in school.
I know for a fact that the schools out there are pressuring parents, and my story is just one story. This whole country is just in a major crisis.
Some teachers expect students to all behave in a very similar way. So when a child may be aggressive, maybe they had too much sugar for breakfast, or maybe they're just naturally more energetic, that child runs a very high probability of being stigmatized for the rest of their life.
When a school teacher or a school psychologist can actually diagnose a child with something that is supposed to be a medical ailment, that's a problem.
The teacher was telling me that he wasn't learning the way he should be learning, that he wouldn't learn unless I opted for the medication, because the medication would help him learn. I unfortunately at that point kind of bowed down to the school and what they were saying and the pressure they were putting on me, and I, went with the drugs.
When you're a stressed, harassed parent, and any of us who have raised children have been stressed, harassed parents, and somebody comes along and says it's not your fault, you've done your best, and gives your child the drug, and all of a sudden your child's easier to manage, it's very easy to misinterpret that as a miracle.
The overprescribing of drugs and the overdiagnosis of ADD says that we are a kind of fix-it-now kind of a society, that will go to any measure to try to solve a problem in the simplest, least painful way.
I think one thing that a lot of parents don't want to admit is just what a nuisance kids are. It gets in the way of the life that they want to live and lead. And now if you're from the working class and you're poor, both parents are having to work, and sometimes more than one job, each of these parents. And so it's very difficult to be able to do the job of raising the kids. And the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors have found a convenient way to prescribe pills so that these people can continue to work lousy jobs for little pay, where they're overworked, they don't get paid for overtime, et cetera, and don't worry about your kids because, they're okay. They're properly medicated.
It's just hard for me to accept that the easy way is the right way. Just because it's easy to drug a kid and get them to be compliant doesn't make it right to do it.
Once they get tested, that's it. They get labeled, and they're in that system. The school gets money. The government is paying extra money for this. And so it's to the drug companies, of course, advantage to be able to have this public. It's a captive public, and it's sent in through teachers.
And it's not just the teachers. I want to make this clear. It could be the counselor, it could be the principal, it could be the special ed instructor. I don't want to paint teachers in a bad light. And personally, a lot of teachers are frustrated, and they think this is the answer because that's what they have been told, and they don't really realize the dangers.
There isn't a whole lot of opportunities for unity, for team building between parents and and teachers, because we're just in such a fast-paced society that we just don't have the time to sit down and really build a plan that's going to work for that child.
The teachers have such a rough go of it these days. Overcrowded classrooms, textbooks that are 30 years old, roofs that leak. We have made public education such a low priority in our society. We just don't really give a damn about our kids, and that's why we put so little effort into education. And if we can just have them medicated so they don't cause a riot in the classroom, then, you know, we're in good shape.
They took my son and they put him in the children's shelter on Union Avenue in San Jose. And this is a locked children's facility. It's like a little child's prison. This facility has been audited by the state several times for code violations. The woman who owns this shelter used to be the mayor of Sunnyvale, where I was arrested. It is a for-profit organization, so they actually make money off of the number of children that they apprehend from parents.
Third grade was just horrendous. He started having severe anxiety. He was not going out for recess. He was telling me, "Mom, I don't feel good. I just want to put my head on the desk and go to sleep." He goes, "It doesn't make me feel good. Don't make me take them. I feel like a freak. I feel like, why do I need this? You know, it doesn't make me feel good."
It makes me kind of feel kind of tired and very, very like dizzy and dopey.
It was just so disturbing. As a parent, it's heart-wrenching to hear that your son doesn't want to take something and you have to basically tell him that the school wants him to take it.
Many of the children that are brought to me by parents state the teachers are concerned because the student's not conforming to a certain type of behavior. This is wholly inappropriate. Teachers don't have licenses to practice medicine, and unfortunately physicians who do have licenses don't look for the underlying etiologies oftentimes. They're very quick to grab a prescription pad.
One would not go to a cab driver for a brain operation, and I am sure that the parents of the United States do not intend in sending their children to the public schools of the country to have teachers diagnosing brain or neurologic disorders.
They put my son on Ritalin against my will, and I was just horrified. Every week when I went in to visit him, he would have bruises all over him. I could tell he was on drugs because one time his demeanor would be like all lethargic, and the next time he would be bouncing off the walls, or sometimes he'd be talking to me and he'd just make little movements like that, and I go, "What are you doing that for?" But anyway, I noticed, you know, his mental and physical health was deteriorating.
That is really sad that they're taking these small children out of homes and addicting them to these very powerful mind-altering drugs.
Some cases where a kid is being abused, I mean really abused, either physically or sexually, there is certainly a role for somebody to step in and say, "Hey, that's not right." But for not medicating a kid for something which has not been shown to be a valid medical illness is just a little bit, I think, extraordinary.
The major stimulant drugs like amphetamine, dexedrine, and Ritalin disrupt 3 of the most widespread neurotransmitter systems. They actually send them into overdrive. The brain doesn't like this, so the brain fights back, and it tries to slow itself down in the face of the overdrive. So that every child on these drugs is having these 3 neurotransmitter systems disrupted, and at the same time is having his or her brain fight back. And it's very unstable, and it's very unpredictable, and as a result, you never quite know how a child is going to react to these drugs, other than over time, the brain's going to compensate very heavily for the drugs.
As a parent, I would never have opted to drug my child. The pediatrician, not even recognizing that the anxiety is coming from the drug, is increasing his dosage, and he was having even more anxiety. He started chewing on everything, chewing on his shirt sleeves, chewing on his pencils, chewing paper. just gnawing everything. And I would go into the school and say, listen, he's not going out for recess, he's chewing, you know, this isn't normal. And the school psychologist would say to me, well, maybe he has a different disorder.
The children are a captive population in the public schools of the country, and the diagnosing being done by public school personnel, most importantly by teachers, is not at all what the parents have in mind in sending their children to the public schools.
Well, the final straw was one time I came in to visit him, and the whole side of his face was bruised and swollen. And so I said, that's it. You know, I filed for an emergency protective order in federal court, and I took a picture of it as an exhibit, but the judge denied it without even a hearing. So I thought at that point, that's it. I'm getting my son out of there. My son kept begging me, Mommy, please, you know, get me out of here. Why do I have to stay here? He did not understand why he had to be there. So one day I went to visit him, and he was eating breakfast. I just picked him up and I held him, and I said to the counselor, I just want to show him something outside, and I'll be right back. And I just took him outside. I ran down the stairs, put him in the car, and we just drove off, and I drove to Canada.
You know, it's like the big medical authorities are telling you that there's something wrong with your child. Don't buy it.
It is happening nonetheless because it is orchestrated at the very uppermost levels of the U.S. Department of Education and more specifically Office of Special Education in concert with the National Institute of Mental Health.
We were happy in Canada. We were there for about 2 months. Vincent started coming back to normal. You know, my son was so happy, he kept turning the radio up in the car and he's going, we're out of there, we're out of there. He was so happy. We were both so happy, we were ecstatic.
The pharmaceutical companies have decided that being a child, being an adolescent, is a disease. It's an illness. And somehow it has to be medicated. When in fact, the whole nature of growing up is exactly what those words mean. You are growing up. There is a transition taking place. And anytime you transition, there are ups and downs. There's pain involved. There's sadness involved. There's loss involved. Any of a number of things. And you feel this anytime you make a transition in your life. And the first time you start to experience that is as a child and as an adolescent.
No one ever said, you know, it could be the drugs causing your son to act bizarre. I demanded somebody look into this and say, why isn't he going out for recess? Why doesn't he have as many friends? Why is he chewing? And my whys, they led the pediatrician to change his drug over to Dexedrine, which is just another stimulant.
My dosage went up and up and up and up and up. It was huge, my dosage.
So he didn't improve. He got worse in actuality.
And one of the problems I see a lot of my colleagues doing is medicating the side effect. In other words, so you have a child now who's depressed because they're on Ritalin, so they give them, you know, Prozac or another antidepressant to take care of the side effect of the Ritalin, or they can't sleep, so they give them a drug to put them to sleep. So all of a sudden what we've done is we have children, you know, who are on 2 or 3 different medications because we're medicating the side effects of the original medication.
These children are many times given one drug and have side effects, and then another drug is added, and they have side effects from the other drug, and that's where you get 5 or 6 different drugs for one kid.
I'm seeing kids in my practice on 4 and 5 psychiatric drugs who are psychotic or on the way to becoming psychotic. And when I sit down with the family and say, let's examine the life story, what we find is that it began with little Johnny didn't like school, or little Johnny didn't get along with his teacher, or little Johnny was bored in one of his classes, not even all of his classes, and was put on a stimulant medication, and gradually over the years of one drug on another drug, little Johnny becomes a person unrecognizable to his parents.
I think it's quite possible to sort this out with good diagnosis and good monitoring. First of all, you're not going to generally use both stimulant drugs at the same time. You're going to use one or the other in most cases. And then you may or may not put an antidepressant on unless you feel it's warranted in terms of how the kid is functioning or how they're doing, or if somebody is showing serious signs of depression. So it's true, ADHD and depression can exist side by side, and you might want to have somebody on both those medications, and I've seen it happen a number of times.
Follow-up is really important. These medicines change people's brains, and they actually do it fairly quickly. And I think it's important to see somebody in a couple of weeks and then see them in a month and let them have access to you when you're starting medicines or changing medicines, because without appropriate follow-up, people can get into some significant trouble.
Every drug is a foreign chemical. Every drug is a potential poison. I have been consulted in no less than 10 cases of cardiac deaths due to psychotropic medications. The psychostimulants, methylphenidate, and the amphetamines are known to cause high blood pressure, known to cause cardiac arrhythmias, including cardiac arrest and cardiac death. Matthew Smith from just outside of Detroit had been on Ritalin for approximately 5 years. His parents had wanted to take him off of medication because of recurrent chest pain and shortness of breath, but they were coerced to keep him on the medication.
We were told that if we did not follow up with their evaluation of ADHD and take him to the pediatrician and get him on Ritalin, that Child Protective Services could charge us for educational and emotional neglect.
At age 13, while riding his skateboard, he suddenly keeled over and was dead. The county medical examiner said there was no doubt in that case that the chronic administration of the Ritalin was the cause of death.
On the death certificate it says that he died from the use of methylphenidate, Ritalin.
Ritalin is, for the purposes of classification by the Drug Enforcement Administration, is a Schedule II drug on the same list as cocaine.
The Drug Enforcement Administration puts special regulations over how many prescriptions a doctor can write and how a doctor has to write the prescriptions and keep track of the drugs. It even means the DEA can come raid your office if they get the impression that you're giving out too much of this drug. This is not an ordinary drug under the law.
So essentially, we're trying to solve a problem in the schools by putting our children on kiddie cocaine.
Parents will steal their kids' Ritalin and sell it. Kids will sell Ritalin to each other or give it away for recreational purposes. In fact, Ritalin is one of the most commonly stolen and trafficked drugs in the United States, according to the Drug Enforcement Administration. These are very serious addictive drugs.
Show me the science that if I have 5 kids and you've diagnosed them all as ADD or ADHD, that there's something in their brain chemistry, their biochemistry, something in their body that will prove that they have this mental illness, this disease that justifies this prescription medication or this medical treatment. Now, if they have cancer, you can find it. Hepatitis, it's there. Herpes, it's there. Chickenpox, smallpox, mumps, measles, ulcers. Every other medical condition that's a real medical condition, we can find in the body. Can we find ADD in the body? Well, with millions of kids being diagnosed, stigmatizing them and changing the outcome of their life, I would assume that there's a lot of science to prove what school teachers, social workers, state authorities, medical doctors, pediatricians in particular, are suggesting.
At this time, we do not have a diagnostic test for ADHD. Therefore, the validity of the disorder continues to be a problem.
In 1998, the National Institute of Mental Health held what's called a Consensus Development Conference, in which the aim was to push the diagnosis of ADHD and to push the stimulant drugs. They had 30 experts come together to address an objective panel which would then give a consensus as to what the issues were. And the result was a consensus statement which said that ADHD was controversial, that it had no proven biological basis, that there was a risk of over-medicating our children, and that stimulant drugs have a lot of serious adverse effects.
We do not have an independent diagnostic and valid test, such as a biological test or such as a blood test.
I still want to get to the other part of the question, which is just a description of what you might be looking for. Okay. But before you go on to that, it sounds a little bit like you're saying that the definition is a little like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography, which is you know it when you see it.
No,
I'm concerned.
We're going to disagree, and I would like any member of the panel to describe a typical ADHD in terms of symptomatology. Mark, would you like to? Since you see them in your practice.
I think the panel has been frank, and the difficulties here are immense in terms of
they were caught in a lie at the consensus conference.
It is hard. It's very hard to know how to answer this question. These kids, in my experience, when you see these kids, they are, several standard deviations different in terms of they cannot sit still, they cannot attend, they cannot, even when they are as if driven by a motive. There are some good clinical descriptions of these kids. I think part of the problem is in the community when you are a physician and somebody comes to you as a parent and says, my child might have attention deficit disorder. It's very difficult to know what to do. And how much confirmation do you need? Do you need a teacher who also who sees many kids and says, this kid is 2 standard deviations different from the other kids in my classroom? And the parent says this kid is different, and and then even if you say this child is different, you have immense problems with trying to say, why is this child different? Is this child being abused? Is this child lead poisoned?
As of the consensus conference, they confessed they had no evidence that it was a disease.
I think, I don't think the panel is saying anything different, although we said it in more sophisticated ways, as the diagnosis is a mess. But we all have a belief that we are dealing with a very serious core problem, and that we have a diagnosis that allows us to communicate and gives us research, generates sort of ideas for research. And I think, I think part of the problem is the profession keeps changing the diagnosis. We have DSM-4, the latest thing, but we have no guarantee that DSM-5 won't give us yet another diagnosis.
We forced them under heavy questioning to admit that all the children who were showing up with brain abnormalities in fact had long drug histories, not just even stimulants, but a variety of different kinds of drugs. And we know from animal experiments that many psychiatric drugs, including the stimulants, can cause permanent changes in the brain.
The belief system that psychiatry has these days is no longer has anything to do with scientific evidence. It's in the realm of religion.
Nowhere in the brain or body of children said to have ADD or ADHD can an abnormality be found, or has an abnormality ever been found prior to their drugging. In other words, their drugging is the first abnormality.
However, after the consensus conference was over and the panel had disbanded, the government simply rewrote it and came out with their own conclusions anyway.
The NIMH is doing a lot of research now in the past several years using something called a functional MRI. Most people know what MRIs are. Using scans where they'll inject a certain kind of dye that will go to cells in the brain that use the most sugar, which is the main nutrient of brain cells, to find out where the most activity is during certain times. What they've discovered is that the areas of the brain dealing with decision-making, choices, solving problems, which are all affected by ADHD, are generally smaller in volume than that of normal children. The meanings and ramifications of this I don't think are really appreciated yet, but it shows that there really is a significant and distinct difference in the brains of children who have ADHD and those who don't.
Without looking at the brain, it's guessing. And we feel very strongly, we actually have published research to the effect that scans can help you with diagnosis and can help predict treatment response. We do a study in our clinics called brain SPECT imaging, S-P-E-C-T. SPECT looks at blood flow and activity patterns in the brain. It looks at how your brain works. And what we see in a healthy brain is full, even, symmetrical activity. And what we see in the ADD brain is that when people with ADD try to concentrate, they get decreased or diminished or lower activity in the front part of their brain. And then we target treatment to the specific brain you have. So rather than one treatment fits everybody, we're going to target treatment to your brain. And we've done 25,000 scans over the last 14 years. It's not like I'm basing this on 50 people we've seen. People are different and they need different treatments, even if they come in presenting with the same problem. And one of the things that irritates me, upsets me, is psychiatrists are the only medical specialists that never look at the organ they treat, when no other profession in medicine acts like we do, make diagnoses based on symptom clusters, prescribe powerful treatments that potentially could make you worse.
Very often in my practice, I have patients come in and say, why don't you order an MRI scan for my child with ADHD? I want to know if you can, document or confirm that they have ADHD, and there really is no test that documents ADHD that's, clinically available. These are research tools, and by far and away the issue is not completely resolved. I mean, if we look at the brains of ADHD children versus, non-ADHD children, if any difference there is, it's extremely subtle and could be debated whether there's really a change there or not. So I think the issue is not resolved. About whether we can say, this is an ADHD brain or this is not an ADHD brain.
From 1990 to the present time, researchers mainly at the National Institute of Mental Health have done brain scans on children with ADHD and have compared them to normal control groups. And this research has shown, on average, 10% brain atrophy or brain shrinkage. In all instances, the researchers have concluded and have stated in their conclusions and in abstracts and in press releases that ADHD was the cause of the brain atrophy, making ADHD an actual brain disease. What they neglected to tell the public was that virtually all of the ADHD subject groups had been on long-term stimulant therapy, and that the stimulants themselves, the Ritalin and amphetamines, were the likely cause of the brain atrophy. And so at no time has the scientific literature proven that ADHD is an actual disease, and at no time have they disproven that the drugs used to treat ADHD are themselves the cause of the brain atrophy.
I had no idea that they would pursue me in Canada. We were pulled over by the RCMP. They checked my license, and he said, "Are you aware that the FBI has 2 warrants out for your arrest?" I said, "No, I didn't." But they actually had a $500,000 bounty out for me and my son. The U.S. authorities took my son back to California, and they were going to try to charge me with 2 felonies, 10 years each. I spoke with a Canadian immigration officer who offered me political asylum. I stayed in Canada for 3 years, but I thought, no, I'm going to go right back down there where my son is, back in the belly of the beast, and fight it. That was my only way I was going to get my son returned. So I came back to Santa Clara County, and I spent 4 months in jail. Many people all over the world wrote to the DA and the judge saying, "Why are you doing this to this woman and her child?" And that support helped me to be released from jail.
The school psychologist kept telling me that she believed Michael had another condition. And it wasn't ADHD, and that's maybe because the drugs weren't working. They never said that, well, it could be the drugs causing it. So the school sent me to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist, looking at the school documents, once again, diagnosed him with social anxiety disorder based on the fact that the school documents said that he wasn't socially interacting, and handed me a prescription for Paxil, which is an SSRI, not even approved, FDA approved for children under 18.
I'm concerned that we are not paying attention to what happens when children take Ritalin. Will it lead them to take more powerful medications like Paxil, Prozac? And if so, what happens when people take combination of medications? That is happening.
In 3rd grade, I was put on Paxil. And Paxil, that made me hallucinate and hear things. And I had like a voice in my head telling me to kill people.
When Paxil was prescribed to Corey, we were unaware of the severe side effects. We had only been told about the side effects of nausea, vomiting, and headaches.
When I first started taking medication, I felt pretty much the same. But as time went on, I felt more and more out of it, just not really feeling like things needed to be done, didn't really care.
At the beginning, I was diagnosed with dysthymia by a therapist, though not by a psychiatrist, and then she suggested medication. The psychiatrist diagnosed me with depression, I guess severe depression at one point, and then I started taking Prozac.
A serotonin reuptake inhibitor blocks the reuptake pump of serotonin itself, so it can't go back into the nerve that manufactured it, and there's more and more serotonin in the space between the neurons. So there's a greater chance that the molecule of serotonin can wander across the synapse and hit a receptor site. Exactly how patients go from being depressed to undepressed is still a mystery. No one knows yet. But it's been fascinating because this is a very exciting time for brain chemistry and mental illness, because we're starting to discover things that really cure people like we've never had before, and we're starting to find out how the brain works.
I did feel that I needed some kind of help. I had no idea what they would do for me.
We are seeing new high numbers of kids who feel just sad. A lot of kids are living in a kind of pressure cooker right now. The expectations are that they should get all their A's, become important members of various volunteer groups, to become an ace soccer player, to fill in every moment of their lives with an activity that will show that they are an A achiever. But in fact, sometimes this backfires.
The psychologist suggested that he needed medication. And we've had experience with medication with my wife and postpartum depression, so hey, we were just very at ease with this, and we took him to our family practitioner, and he suggested Paxil.
He became violent.
I almost killed my friend because of his haircut.
He literally flipped out over the fact that the boy next door had a haircut that he didn't like.
When you look at the widespread use of these mind-altering drugs among children, is where you're going to find the answer for the violence that we're seeing in children today.
After being on Paxil for about a year, I was changed to a different drug called Effexor, which is pretty similar. But the feelings I had were just, I was hardly ever there mentally. My mind was going everywhere, couldn't stay focused, couldn't think. I basically felt like I was just in the clouds all the time.
According to my therapist, the Prozac was supposed to sort of give me a boost, get me out of the low place I was at. At first I was resistant to it, but she said that just because you're on it, it doesn't have to be forever. That a lot of people take it and they develop better habits, and they're able to move on with life and eventually wean themselves off of it and not be depressed anymore. That's what it was supposed to do.
He had no control. He came to me in the bathroom and he said to me, "Mom," he goes, "make it stop. I can't control myself. I don't know what I'm doing. Make it stop."
We have a great amount of evidence in the scientific literature that antidepressants and stimulants cause abnormal behaviors in children, in particular out of control aggressive behaviors.
I thought I was going crazy. I was hallucinating, I was seeing things, I was hearing things. While I was on the medication, I felt like that was what was supposed to be going on. I had no idea what would happen to me, what other people would think, because that's what I thought was the normal thing.
What we've seen is depression is not one illness. It's at least 6 or 7 different things. And if you give everybody the same medicine, give everybody, we call them SSRIs, medicines like Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Lexapro, Celexa, you'll make some people better, no question about it. And you'll make other people worse. So one treatment doesn't fit everybody.
Understandably, what works for one patient might not be what works for another patient. You don't want to be too formulaic and in a cookie-cutter kind of way give the same thing to every person reflexively.
It made me lose weight. I liked that. I had more energy. I liked that. I didn't feel as tired all the time. I didn't sleep as much. I went out more. I felt superficially better, I guess, in a sense, but not really, because it didn't really make my life better on a deep level, on an emotional level, just sort of superficially.
He told us that he'd seen dark figures and heard voices while he was sitting in class at school. We also were found out through deposition by a friend of his that he had told her that he'd had a terrible, horrible nightmare about going into school with a gun, and this was a year before he actually went into school with a gun.
There's a direct link and association between psychotropic drugs and violent behavior. As the Archives of General Psychiatry said in 1973, stimulants can cause impulsive murderous violence, such as we're seeing today with children going into schools and shooting their classmates in prayer groups.
I remember getting the call that Corey had come to school with a gun, and I raced to school. And we spent some time with Corey in the principal's office. Corey was just a pile of sweat. I mean, he was sweating. He looked confused. He didn't know. He just had this look on his face of horror and scared and fear.
In Dallas, we had 2 children on Paxil this summer, a boy 10 and a girl who just turned 15, who stabbed their 6-year-old brother to death and buried him out back. Both kids on one of these drugs.
We didn't know it was a drug because they were telling us, the psychiatrists, the school, they kept saying, he needs to be on drugs, on these medications. And at one point I had the school psychologist saying he needs to be on medication to be in class.
A majority of these children that have gone on shooting sprees, Conyer, Georgia, Paducah, Kentucky, Columbine, and Colorado, these children were on psychotropic drugs.
My name is Mark Taylor, and I was shot at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. I believe that they did this because of the adverse reactions to the drug Luvox.
I am a medical expert in 2 cases surrounding the shootings in Columbine, so I have probably as much knowledge of what actually went on as any doctor does. And I can tell you that Eric Harris took Luvox on the day that he did the shootings, or perhaps the night before, because he had a normal, effective level of Luvox in his blood on autopsy. I have seen the data.
I was shot outside the school. I was with 5 or 6 of my friends when it happened, and we were just sitting down talking. And about 10 minutes later, I got a shotgun in my leg, hit me in the leg, and then the killer went over and shot Rachel Scott. And he came back and shot me 5 or 6 more times in the chest. And he threw 2 pipe bombs in the parking lot. And then he went downstairs and shot someone else, and he proceeded on into the high school.
I found a clinical study reported in the literature in which a child, while taking Prozac in a clinical trial, developed fantasies of murdering his classmates and being murdered by them. These fantasies and nightmares became so real that the child became confused about what reality was.
I'm gonna pull out a goddamn shotgun and blow your damn head off. Do you understand?
Prozac is closely related to Luvox.
I was laying on the ground, and I was praying to God for him to someone to come help me, because it took the police so long to get there. A half an hour later, a police car finally showed up, and he was providing me cover. And another police officer picked me up and he put me in his car and took me to the triage. He saved my life.
These are things that are discussed in the back pages of journals, periodicals, textbooks, and then when we see them on the news, we're somehow told that, well, these kids were bullied. It's because of the way that they were brought up. It's because of they didn't have self-esteem, or guns were readily available. The problem with that is we're not looking at what drove those children to pick up that gun, to decide that all of their classmates needed to be killed. And what we're seeing is a result of the administration of psychotropic drugs to children.
In Bowling for Columbine, we never really came up with the answer in terms of why this happened. I think we did a good job of exposing all the reasons that were given were a bunch of BS. You know, Marilyn Manson caused them to do it, this or that caused them to do it. And none of it really made any sense. That's why I believe there should be an investigation in terms of what pharmaceuticals, prescribed pharmaceuticals, these kids were on. And perhaps parents, it would have a shocking, it would be shocking, I think, to the millions of parents who prescribe this for their kids if it was finally explained to them, if this is the case, that this perhaps occurred for no other reason other than because of these prescriptions. Imagine what that would do. Imagine how people would totally rethink things, grasping for every little straw they can to explain why something like Columbine happens, when in fact it may be nothing more than this. How else do you explain two otherwise decent kids, very smart, no history of violence to other kids in the school? Why them? Why did this happen? It's an extremely legitimate question to pose, and it demands an investigation.
Well, the moment I woke up was really in a cell of the juvenile detention center, and pretty much had a little tiny window to look out of, but I just laid on the bed, and people were walking by. I could see people, was terrified, didn't know what to say, didn't know who to call for. I've never had any amnesia symptoms before this happened. Eventually somebody, asked me if I was all right and asked me if I knew I was there, and they eventually told me.
A few months after Corey was arrested and in detention, I happened to have a chance to talk to Clint, who's Corey's friend, and I asked Clint, I said, when Jamie asked Corey, "Are you going to hurt us?" what did Corey do? And Clint said he looked down at the gun like he was surprised it was there. And then he stopped, and he was real quiet. We found out after Corey was arrested, and it was a couple of weeks later, Corey finally confided in one of the counselors that he'd been hallucinating. And he was seeing, the counselor called me at home and said, "Are you aware that Corey's been hallucinating?" And I said, "No, I'm not aware. And we just saw him Sunday." And she says, "Well, he says he's been seeing tigers and bears and things in his room and outside his room." So that had me concerned, because that was the first time I had been aware that these things can cause hallucinations. These kids can be in what they call a dream state.
I was held at the Grant County Juvenile Detention Center for a total of 14 months. Coming from a really small town, being in the juvenile center was a pretty big experience for me. I really had no idea what went on. I felt pretty intimidated at first.
This is the insert to the drug Luvox that Eric Harris was taking the day that he went on his rampage. A few of the side effects are listed here. Two of them are listed as frequent, are mania and psychosis. One of my cousins knew Eric Harris very well. She was in a class with him, and she said he used to bring her flowers and cookies every day, and he was a very nice kid. She had no idea that he would do this. I don't think they had a plot to kill who and such persons. I think they just went nuts on these drugs, and they just went on a killing spree.
In the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, kids had access to guns, possibly more than they even do now. And yet you did not see the school shootings. The difference I see then and now, with this being a whole new phenomenon, the school shootings, is the drugs.
Yeah, I've had people say, don't you feel guilty because you had the gun available? The gun wasn't the problem, it was the drugs. We've had guns around our house all the time. I was raised with guns in the house. I knew the gun was there. The gun wasn't locked up. This was a gun that Corey's grandpa had given him. Corey had used it to go hunting. I felt at ease with Corey having the gun there. If Corey hadn't been on the drugs, there wouldn't have been any problem.
I do not believe that the sole or even the principal reason that kids kill other kids is because they have easy access to firearms these days. And I don't believe that because kids have had easy access to firearms forever. When I was a kid growing up in a small town in the Midwest, there were guns all over the house, and everybody I knew owned guns. I owned a gun from the time I was 12 years old, but none of us shot one another.
In fact, the psychiatrist that we hired, he said, well, we don't know because of Corey's amnesia whether he was hallucinating that he was hunting. And we know that he was hallucinating later in detention on effexor. He was seeing lions and bears in his room. So we don't know because of the amnesia.
No doubt that having guns available too freely allows for a larger violence, and nobody, no adult, wants guns available to children. We should do everything to keep them out of their hands. And there's also no doubt that some of these shootings have been in part because the kids became psychotic or out of control on psychiatric medications.
To have a whole nation that is totally dependent on the advertising industry and the drug industry to gauge our health is erroneous. We can't continue to go down this brainwashed route and expect to come out at the end healthy.
Most practicing psychiatrists get their information about new drugs from pharmaceutical company representatives. The pharmaceutical companies spend $8 billion a year on sales representatives, and those sales representatives give out $8 billion in samples a year. So that there's $16 billion being spent on pharmaceutical reps visiting doctors and touting their latest magic remedy.
Jonathan Coles, director of psychopharmacology at the NIMH, he and another physician from Harvard presented a paper to the FDA. The paper said there's a 3 times higher rate of suicidability from Prozac. Unfortunately, they would not even let them show their slides, and that wouldn't really present the material. Now, this is a very high-ranking people. These are 2 people from Harvard. In fact, the original research on the Prozac actually included the use of minor tranquilizers to balance the stimulating effect. That was part of the original, many of the original studies. So we need to understand it acts as a stimulant, and as a stimulant, it creates what I call a hypomanic state. In some cases, you can even get a manic state.
At one point, I just started feeling, I couldn't point my finger on it, but I just started feeling weird, just not right. I was having really paranoid thoughts. A week later, I just started to act weird. I started to be manic, and I went to work, and everything that everybody said was just like this deep thing. Like, I read into it whatever I wanted straight into it. I would look at people and I would think, wow, I've been really mean to you the whole time I've worked here, which, I mean, I hadn't, but this is what I'm thinking, and I start crying. Meanwhile, the conversation we're having is, how's your day? How was your day? Oh, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. Meanwhile, I'm looking at him like crying. And everyone knew I wasn't quite right.
Under the guise of training, the drug companies pay for professorships. In some cases, they support whole laboratories in universities. They pay for the distribution of major journals, such as the Archives of General Psychiatry, which is sent to all the psychiatrists in the country free of charge because a drug company pays for it.
I left work that day, got on the subway. I had to get off. I couldn't. I went to my friend's job, and I was like, you have to pay for a cab for me to get home because I can't be on the subway. I kept thinking that I smelled. I kept thinking that people were looking at me and talking about me. From there on in, it just got worse and worse.
We're talking about a symbiotic relationship between psychiatry and the drug industry. Reminds one a little bit of what Eisenhower talked about when he left office about the military-industrial complex. You have to watch out for what they're doing because they'll just take over.
I knew, and I think people know, that they're not okay, that there's just something is awry, but there's nothing you can do about it.
The pharmaceutical industry is extraordinarily powerful. They just have very, very deep pockets and pretty much do what they want.
They provide lecturers around the country. They sponsor the vast majority of the credit courses doctors have to take to keep their licenses up to date. They provide free conferences in the conferences of the annual meetings of the psychiatric and medical associations. They'll provide dinners and music and breakfasts. It's like a drug company carnival when you go to the annual American Psychiatric Association meetings.
I knew why. I knew it was the drug, and I felt like hopefully it wouldn't get worse, but it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And a lot of it I just don't remember. Honestly, I feel fortunate to have blacked out, and I don't want to remember, or I don't want to know all of the things that I did. I know enough, and while I know it wasn't me, and while I know it wasn't my fault and it was the effect of the drug, it's still unpleasant to think of yourself doing these things. But it got to the point where apparently I was getting violent. So then they eventually, because of that, they had to call the ambulance to come get me.
You can hardly find an academic psychiatrist who is not on the payroll of a drug company. The New England Journal of Medicine, for example, looked for an expert in antidepressant drugs to write a review of antidepressant drugs, and they could not find anyone who qualified as an expert who was not on the payroll of one of the companies making the drugs. I mean, it's like they've bought the field.
I remember being put on the stretcher and taken out. I remember being outside and feeling like, just knowing like, okay, like there's an ambulance and I'm on a stretcher. I was just terrified. And I remember I'm in the ambulance and my parents are in there and I'm just really scared. And I went and got to the hospital and I was examined by the doctor. And then they took me to a place, armed guard, like very dark. We weren't allowed to leave your room. So I was in that place, I don't even really know for how long. And we're sort of coming to, I guess, when I was there and asking my mother, what day it was. And I was really surprised. It was like a week later than I thought it was.
I don't know if anybody really wants to know what I think about the doctor that prescribed these drugs. I mean, he put them on medication that can cause hallucinations, did not tell us about the side effects. All we heard about was the computer printout that they give you at the pharmacy that says nausea, headaches, and vomiting. It didn't tell us about the abnormal dreams, the hallucinations, the depersonalization, which Corey experienced when he was telling us that what he remembered was seeing himself with a backpack on and a gun in his hand. When I heard that in detention, to me, it sounded like an out-of-body experience. So I was concerned, and I called the psychiatrist that we'd hired, and he said, well, that's depersonalization, and it's a side effect of the drug.
Eli Lilly and Company found out that their patients taking Prozac had a higher suicide attempt rate than the same patient, sometimes literally the very same patient, on a sugar pill. So what did they do with that data? They hid it.
The Eli Lilly Corporation, a pharmaceutical company, for nearly 15 years covered up their own internal investigation that showed that anyone on Prozac is 12 times more likely to attempt suicide than those using other antidepressants, not 12 times more than the average population, 12 times more than those already on other antidepressants. This is a criminal act. And I want to know why these criminals are still walking the streets.
Now, it should be noted that Eli Lilly has stated that the drug was never intended for young children, but for those 18 and older. And 10 or not, ask how many parents have young children they're giving Prozac. Well, how did they get it? You cannot obtain it without a prescription.
The doctor told us that he thought the drug Prozac would help Jacob, that it's a common prescribed drug used in teenagers now, that he thought it would help him with his moods and just make him feel happier. So he was put on Prozac that afternoon, 10 milligrams. The morning of my son's death, we had talked that morning. He did not want to go to school that day, and he just said that he would go the next day. They were getting out for Christmas holidays. I left for work, and a few hours later I began to call home because with him being at home by himself, I was concerned, so I did not get an answer. And I continued to call for a couple of hours, then I left, and it took me 30 minutes to get home, and I found my son hanging in our attic. My husband and I attended a FDA hearing in Washington about the side effects that can happen with these drugs, and unfortunately the first hearing there was 65 parents there. Their children had died while on antidepressants. Some of them were on the drug a matter of days before they committed suicide.
There is also evidence linking antidepressants and suicide in adults.
After being on Prozac for 21 days, my wife shot and killed both of these two boys right here. She turned the gun to herself and shot herself twice. Now she's in jail for murder.
Since I've been on Prozac, I've experienced the following adverse reactions. A drug-induced insanity that has caused several self-destructive outbursts. There was an extended period of anger, rage, and hostility, and it turned into terrible feelings that suicide was the only answer.
This is hard for me because I tried to commit suicide in front of my 5 children. I didn't know what I was doing. I don't remember exactly what happened. All I know is that my husband took the gun away from me and my children was looking from the other room. What would have happened if these children had seen their mother commit suicide?
My sister did commit suicide in front of Lindsay. Another woman spoke of hollow point bullets. That's what my sister used to do it.
The side effects of some of these drugs can be increased suicidal ideation. There's a recent black box warning by the government that giving these drugs to children and adolescents could increase suicidality. The facts are that's true. There was an increase in suicidal ideation in the studies that they did, which were questionnaire studies amongst the children. But it was not an increase in suicide. It was an increase in suicidal thoughts. The recommendation was that anybody being treated for this should be monitored closely. Well, I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, as a psychiatrist, I feel any patient I place on an antidepressant has to see me at least once a week until I feel the drug has been safely monitored and established, and I may even continue that long afterwards. I don't see any rationale for just prescribing a drug and telling somebody to come back in 3 months and let them know how it's working. That's poor medicine.
All I can say is these children are put on these drugs for reasons that are so unnecessary. These are psychotropic drugs that have deadly side effects to some children, especially children that do not need to be on them. If you're clinically depressed, these drugs can help your children. But if you're not depressed, these drugs can kill your children. And that is what has happened to so many of our children, is they were put on these drugs when they should have never been placed on them.
One cannot expect the pharmaceutical industry nor the medical industry to take responsibility for each and every child in this nation. The responsibility lies with each of us as parents to take control of our health back.
What you want to do is look for alternatives. There are other things you can be doing. You can check on their diet. You can check on sleep. Have them check for allergies. Go to your medical doctor and talk to them about other kinds of therapies that have not got to do with the actual medical route. It can be a natural kind of program.
We noticed that Corey's anxiety, now we know, it was only happening early in the morning. He'd get up in the morning and he'd be anxious about going to school, and he'd just fret about it, and he just said, I can't go to school. And then later on in the morning, he would tell his mom, hey, Mom, take me to school. I feel better. And we feel now that it was his low blood sugar. He hadn't had anything to eat, and he's an eater.
Many children go to school, they don't have any food, they become hypoglycemic. Or they may put a Pop-Tart in the toaster and go to school, and the next thing you know, they're hyperglycemic, then hypoglycemic, and have behavior problems because of that.
So many families accept a prescription for their child before looking first at what is that child eating? What is the child being served in school or at a fast food restaurant or the junk food store on the way home? If you're not looking there, you're not looking at the source of the problem.
I think ADHD has a much clearer diagnostic criteria, other than diet, and certainly one would take a history about diet and food and what kids eat in terms of making a diagnosis. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence about that, and certainly it can't be discounted. But I'm not sure that's the cause of ADHD. I'm not saying that it doesn't cause other problems, and it may cause hyperactivity in some kids who are not ADHD.
I believe that a big part of his problem was anger and poor nutrition. And when I say poor nutrition, I don't mean that he had to eat crackers and water. I mean that it was all processed food. It's the way I was raised.
His friends were all have the driver's licenses. They were going down to the Texaco station, getting the big gulp or the candy bars, and I think that was more lunch than the school lunch was.
Do you see a difference in their behavior based on what they eat?
Absolutely. Yes.
What's the difference?
I could line them up without looking in their lunchbox and tell you who has too much sugar in their lunchbox, who didn't eat breakfast. It's easy. It's easy.
We are a junk food nation. They bring the junk food in for the kids to eat. The PTO moms will go out and buy the junk food, buy the pizza, buy the McDonald's hamburgers, and bring them into the kitchens at school and sell them to the kids. That's school lunch.
They're drinking Coke, eating burgers, French fries, junk food. You have all that junk food.
Nothing healthy. No fresh fruit. Nothing healthy.
And that definitely can affect a child's behavior.
I think there are two issues that are of particular concern to me. One is all of the junk that gets cooked into foods, colors, flavors, sugar, but then also the tremendous influx of cheese, dairy products, fatty foods. These things, the additives can affect children's attention and ability to concentrate, and the fatty foods can affect them hormonally so that they actually feel differently. They may have higher levels of hormones that can make them domineering and aggressive. It's a real serious problem.
There's so many different allergies that they're suffering from because of our diets.
We think a child is misbehaving or a little bit slow or a little antsy. We don't realize that it's something that child had for breakfast or for lunch that's influencing the way they feel and the way they behave.
No one other than Dr. Tracy has mentioned that nutrition is a big part of it.
Corey's MD that prescribed the drugs never mentioned. I mean, I think he's probably spent 10 minutes with Corey in his doctor's office, and no one, the psychologist, no one has mentioned the possibility of nutrition being the problem, or allergies or anything else.
I didn't know that a physical examination was required before being prescribed Prozac. I mean, I don't think any of the doctors who prescribed it to me asked for a physical examination.
Until I started doing my own research, nobody ever told me about the importance of diet. You hear that. You think that, they're health nuts. Go eat a granola bar or something. But you don't understand the importance of what you put into your body until you see a young man like my son being poisoned. And that's what he is. He's poisoned.
They are not looking at kids today as the next generation that they really need to care for and nurture. They're looked at as potential markets.
Whatever doctor it is has people from these companies visiting them and, giving them things to prescribe you their drug.
My son Sam is 4. We noticed that his activity level was very high, and I called our early childhood development program in our school system and had him screened for developmental disabilities. The first suggestion that they had for us was that they wanted to bring in their expert pediatrician on ADHD to evaluate Sam. And then they mentioned medication. And these two teachers didn't realize the fact that we had been through the nightmare that we had with our older son and medications, and we're insisting on behavioral modifications And I don't see any need for Ritalin at this point or any kind of medication if he's handled properly in the classroom.
So now I'm free, I'm out of jail, but the problem remains I still have no idea where my son is.
I'm from Gary Nell & Associates in New York City, and we're doing a story on Vincent Booth. And we wanted to see if we could interview someone.
No. So I don't know what condition he's in. I'm worried about it. And I hope that the next hearing I have with Judge Leonard Edwards will result in a visitation with my son and eventual reunification. Most Americans will ask, how can this happen in America? I don't believe that this could happen in America. Well, it is happening. If there's one thing I've learned about this whole nightmare, it's that I never imagined how powerful the government can be. I had a perfectly normal life. I was a notary public. I had a perfect driver's license record for 35 years. Never got in trouble, never been in jail. And now I had everything taken from me, including my son. I have nothing.
You need to get off our property. I just want to speak to someone about Vincent Booth. You need to get off our property right now.
I'm like a pariah, according to the government.
In the town of Mattawa where I lived, they have banned me from it. I mean, I can't even be within 25 miles of the town. And I mean, it's going to be that way for at least 5 years.
I don't know what his future is going to be. I don't know whether he'll ever be weaned off of any of this medication. At one point, I caught him with aerosol cans. He was using them as inhalants. I don't know if he'll ever live by himself. I don't think he can. And I think that at this point, he's relying so much on medications that he doesn't think he can ever live without them.
Since I took the drugs, since I had the manic episode, I feel like that experience just kind of affected me in a way that still affects my everyday life in some way. I went through a point where it was really hard for me to even be on the subway. It's not like that anymore. I mean, I just kind of go through my everyday life. But there's something beneath the surface and something that's changed. Even if the physical effects of the drug are gone, there are just things that stay with you.
One thing we learned from this whole experience is that we're a strong family. And that God blessed us. And blessed us with good friends and a good family. Because of Corey's sentencing, we had over 50 people from the community came to be with Corey, along with 15 of the staff members from the detention center, which had never been done before. And they all together, with their supervisors, wrote a letter to the prosecutor stating that they didn't think Corey should be in jail and he should be let out.
I mean, the real issue is that you trust doctors and you trust these people who are counseling you and, giving you things that are supposed to make you better. And, it's one thing for them not to make you better. It's another thing for them to give you one of the worst experiences you've ever had in your life.
But whose purpose does this serve?
I think a number of actors are seeing their purposes served. Parents who are overwhelmed with the demands of work, with making a living and making it in society, the way they've been taught that one is supposed to make it, they find something in there. Teachers find something in there because of they can manage their classes a little more easily when a third of the children are drugged. Pharmaceutical companies find it in their interest because their profits are soaring. Advertisers find it in their interest because they're advertising these drugs, and doctors are prescribing and so forth. So there's a search for power and control by a number of individuals.
We are increasing the diagnostic net of conditions that are neuropsychiatric, whether it's social anxiety. What does that mean? A person's shy? No, they have social anxiety. Shyness is not a disease. And if a person is not adversely affected by being shy, why are we calling this social anxiety that needs Paxil?
Stop the labeling. Stop the labeling and stop the drugging,
And let's start talking about healthfulness. Let's start talking about how to live healthy, happy, prosperous lives. And that's far more therapeutic than putting drugs into kids and telling them they're disordered in some way.
I think the best hope is for parents to really take the ball and try to find the best help for their children and to work hard with their children. And again, it's not the case that parents are bad parents. If they have a child who has inattention, difficulty concentrating, difficulty focusing, and hyperactive behaviors, the major solution is finding a way to parent that child and find a parenting style that matches their child's personality.
I think parents care. They want the best for their children. It's just that we've become so short-sighted as to what's important that they don't even know what to care about exactly.
Depression in children is not a biological phenomena. Depression in children is a spiritual, psychological, and social issue. Kids get depressed for reasons, and whether or not the reasons are the parents or the teachers, because there can be other reasons why kids get depressed, including our society, including the culture they're in, their peer cultures. But whatever the reason kids get depressed, the solution is in the hands of adults to provide children hope, to empower children, to give children a sense that they can matter in their own world and in the larger world. There is no substitute for adults in the lives of children giving them hope. Hope does not lie in a pill.
My mom decided to take me off the drugs because I was, flipping out, was twitching, going crazy.
I had taken him off all the drugs by December of 1999. The Paxil, he had come off in a month. After we removed Paxil in October of 1999, he hallucinated. He had told his teacher he heard a voice in his head telling him to do bad things. And one occasion he was banging his head against the desk, and he was asked repeatedly by the teacher to stop, and he couldn't.
I started blacking out and dizzy, really dizzy, and going to sleep. I could not stay awake, headaches.
Discontinuation of the drugs can be a problem, especially drugs that have a relatively short half-life means that they are quickly excreted and dissipated. If one is on a substantial dose of these drugs, there are side effects that can occur. Not side effects, what we call withdrawal effects. And these can be quite unpleasant, causing irritation, headache, syndrome that looks something like a flu-like illness, or maybe even stomach problems.
I found it interesting that once we decided, he needed to be weaned off the drugs, and I talked to Dr. Tracy, and I'd learned a lot about weaning the drugs and tapering off. I had to tell the MD how to do it and what prescriptions we needed.
When we decided to start taking me off of the medication, I thought it was a great thing. I felt really good about it. And as I was getting off, less and less of a dosage, I started feeling better and better.
Corey was on 300 milligrams, and so he lowered it to 225, and he was on that for a couple of weeks. And we slowly lowered him down from 225 to 150 and then 75. And we know that it was too fast, because when he got to 37.5 milligrams, he finally had a clear head, and he just said he's not taking them anymore, and he cold turkeyed off of Effexor. And within 2 days, he was just a ball of emotion. So we talked him back on the drugs, and he calmed down, and then we slowly brought him down from 375 to 25 milligrams to 20 milligrams. And then we had to go to a compounding pharmacy to bring him down, and we brought him down 5 milligrams at a time over about a month-and-a-half period. And he's been off the drugs since then.
All these drugs should not be discontinued precipitously, but again, if they are to be stopped, they should be stopped under the supervision of a physician and stopped on a slow basis. Drugs like Prozac can be stopped easily because it takes so long for them to be dissipated from the body, for the metabolites to be excreted, that there is no real withdrawal syndrome. But other drugs such as Paxil or Zoloft may have a relatively short life in the body, in which case discontinuation has to be closely monitored.
When I pulled my son, Michael, off all the drugs and stopped them, within 3 weeks he shot up in height, in weight. He looked healthier. At one point, the school teacher, feeling very sorry about the whole ordeal, came to our house with her sympathy, and she looked at him and she said, "Michael, you look wonderful." And to me, it was a different child. He looked healthy. He never looked healthy on the drugs. He looked gaunt. He looked wasted, like he was wasting away. He was always tired, didn't have an appetite. And now I've had my little boy back again.
Everybody has emotional issues in life and goes through points when they're depressed, and it doesn't mean they have a disease. And I now know, or I've known, that I don't have a disease and I don't have anything wrong with me, and I'm not doomed to be depressed forever.
Over the last 13 years, as I have worked with so many people on these medications and seen them as they have slowly withdrawn off of the meds and gotten their lives back together again, it's like watching someone being born, because they say over and over again, "I have my life back. I can do this, I can do that." It's so sad to see how many things you can no longer do when you take these medications, and yet when you wean them slowly off of the drugs, and then they begin to rebuild their body with the nutrients that they need and that the drugs have depleted from their systems, they become whole again. They can function again, and they're so grateful to just be normal.
Now that I'm off the drugs, I feel really great. I feel like I can, be myself, do things for myself, actually do things, I know what's going on now. I can take hold of my life and really get it going.